My grandson smelled like sawdust and something sour when I pulled him out of that wall, and I don't think I'll ever forget that smell for the rest of my life. I want to back up. I need to back up, because if I just stood there, you won't understand how completely blind I was. How a man can live in a house for 11 years and not see what's happening right underneath his own roof. I ask myself that question every single morning when I wake up. I don't have a good answer. I'm 53 years old. I work in logistics, supply chain coordination for a regional freight company outside of Columbus, Ohio. It's not glamorous work, but it pays steady, and I've been good at it for 22 years. I'm the kind of man who notices when a shipment is 3 boxes short or when a manifest doesn't add up. Detail-oriented. That's what my supervisor always put on my performance reviews. Detail-oriented and dependable. My wife and I had been married for 26 years. Her name is Lorinda. She's 4 years younger than me, dark hair going silver now, and for most of those 26 years I thought she was the most capable person I'd ever met. She managed everything. The house, the finances, the social calendar. I worked long hours. She handled the rest. I told myself that was partnership. I told myself I was lucky. We have one daughter together. Savannah, she's 28 now, and she married a man named Burke 3 years ago. Burke works in HVAC installation. Good man. Quiet. The kind of quiet that takes a while to understand. Not cold, just careful with his words. They live about 20 minutes from us, which I always liked. Close enough to see on weekends, far enough that nobody's in each other's business. Savannah had our grandson, Mateo, when she was 25. He came early, 34 weeks, spent 12 days in the NICU, and I think that scared something permanent into all of us. Into Savannah especially. She is not a casual mother. She is attentive in the way that only comes from genuine fear, from knowing how close you came to losing something. Mateo was 6 years old when this happened. Bright kid. Obsessed with dinosaurs the way only 6-year-olds can be. Not just T-Rex and Triceratops, but the obscure ones, the ones I'd never heard of. Pachycephalosaurus. Dinochirus. He'd correct you with complete patience if you got something wrong. No frustration, just, actually, Grandpa, that one was from the Cretaceous, not the Jurassic. Like a tiny professor in light-up sneakers. Savannah had gone back to work part-time that September. She was doing billing for a dental office, Tuesdays and Thursdays. Lorinda had offered to watch Mateo on those days, and Savannah had been grateful. We had the space. I was at work anyway. It seemed like a natural arrangement. I never questioned it. That's the part that stays with me. I got sick on a Tuesday in October. It came on fast, the kind of sick where you're fine at 8 in the morning and by 10 you can barely lift your head off your desk. Fever, chills, everything aching. My manager sent me home around 10:30, told me to rest. Don't come back until I'd been symptom-free for 24 hours. I drove home on autopilot. I remember the highway looking too bright, the way everything looks when you have a fever and the world has a weird, thin quality to it. I pulled into the driveway at 11:15. Lorinda's car was there. My sister-in-law Petra's car was there too, which I registered without really thinking about it. Petra was over sometimes. They were close. I came in through the garage door into the kitchen. The house was quiet in a way that felt wrong, though I couldn't have told you why. Not silent. There were sounds. The refrigerator hum. The furnace kicking on. But the particular absence of a 6-year-old is something you feel. Mateo was loud, not disruptive, just present. He'd be playing with his dinosaur figures on the living room rug and narrating to himself in this low, serious voice. You'd always know where he was. I didn't hear him. I figured they were in the backyard or maybe he was napping. I went upstairs to change out of my work clothes, moving slowly because my head was pounding. The hallway upstairs was dim. As I passed the closed door to the guest room, I heard something. A sound. It was faint. If I hadn't been moving slowly, if the house hadn't been so quiet, if the fever hadn't made me hyper-aware of everything, I might have missed it, but I stopped. Stood there in the hallway in my work shirt with my hand on the wall for balance. Scratching. Faint, rhythmic, coming from inside the wall. from behind the drywall of the guest room. My first thought was exactly what you'd think. Squirrels. We'd had a squirrel get into the attic 2 years before, and the sound was something like this, that irregular skittering. I stood there for another moment. Then I heard something else. Not scratching. Something more like a tap. One tap, then two. Deliberate. I opened the guest room door. The room was as it always was. Bed made, nothing out of place. The sound was clearer in here. Coming from the far wall, the one that shared space with the bathroom. I pressed my ear against the drywall. The tapping came again. And underneath it, so faint I almost convinced myself I was imagining it, a sound that was almost like breathing. I stepped back. I looked at the wall. It had been repainted, recently. I could see it now that I was looking, a slightly different sheen to this section, maybe 4 feet wide, running floor to ceiling. Fresher than the rest. The baseboards didn't quite match either. The paint was the same color, but not the same age. I went back downstairs. My heart was doing something strange in my chest, something that had nothing to do with the fever. Lorinda was in the kitchen now. She'd come in through the back door while I was upstairs, and she had a glass of water in her hand. And she looked at me with that specific kind of surprise that people show when they weren't expecting you. "You're home," she said. "Got sent home sick." I looked at her. "Where's Mateo?" She didn't answer immediately. The pause was maybe 2 seconds. It felt like longer. "He's napping," she said. "Upstairs." "Which room?" "The guest room." She said it without missing a beat. Smooth. 26 years, and she was smooth. "He's not in the guest room," I said. "I was just up there." Something moved across her face. Gone before I could name it. "He must be in the bathroom then," she said. "He has a thing about playing in there with his dinosaurs near the tub." I didn't say anything. I turned around and went back up the stairs. She followed me, and I could hear Petra coming from somewhere in the house. Footsteps on the hardwood. I went into the guest room. I stood in front of that wall. I pressed my hand flat against it. From inside I felt it more than heard it. A vibration. Small and desperate. I don't know how to describe what happened to me in that moment, except to say that something very old and very animal took over. Something that didn't need to think. I went to the garage. I kept a reciprocating saw on the second shelf, and a utility knife, and a flashlight. My hands were shaking when I grabbed them. Not from the fever. When I came back up the stairs, Lorinda was in the doorway of the guest room. Petra was behind her. Petra had something in her hand, and it took me a second to register what it was. A syringe. Not a medical syringe, not something clinical. Something else. "You need to go back downstairs," Petra said. Her voice was very calm. "You're sick. You need to rest." I looked at her. Then I looked at my wife. Lorinda didn't say anything. She looked at the floor. I pushed past both of them. I drove the utility knife into the drywall at chest height. It went through soft. Too soft. Like it had been replaced recently with cheaper material. I pulled the knife down in a long vertical cut and the drywall buckled. I hit it once with my palm, and it caved inward. Behind it, in the dark space between the studs, was my grandson. He was sitting with his knees pulled to his chest. His wrists were tied together with zip ties. There was a strip of duct tape across his mouth, but it had slipped, partly worked off, and I could see the red marks on his cheeks from where he'd been rubbing it against his shoulder. That was how he'd been making the sounds. That was how he'd tapped. He blinked in the light. His eyes found mine. He didn't make a sound. He just looked at me the way a child looks when they've been very frightened for a very long time, and they're not sure yet whether being found means being safe. I reached in and picked him up. He weighed almost nothing, or maybe I just couldn't feel my arms. I carried him to the hallway. I looked back once at Lorinda, who was standing in the center of the room with her arms crossed over her chest and her face doing something I had never seen it do before. A kind of blank, sealed expression, like a door that has been locked from the inside. I carried Mateo downstairs. I sat on the kitchen floor with him in my lap, and I cut the zip ties with my utility knife. And I held him and I said over and over, the only thing I could think to say, You're okay. I've got you. You're okay. I've got you. You're okay? He said very quietly, against my neck. Grandpa, there's a door in the basement. I called 911, then I called Savannah. I will not describe what it sounded like when Savannah answered the phone and I told her what I had found. That is hers. I won't put it into words. The police arrived in 9 minutes. I know because I counted them. I sat on the kitchen floor with Mateo and I watched the driveway through the front window and I counted the minutes and I did not look away from my grandson. When the officers came in, Petra was gone. Lorinda was sitting at the kitchen table with her coat on, which struck me as strange. Coat on, purse in her lap, like she was waiting for a bus. The officers detained her before she reached the door. Petra was found 40 minutes later, 2 miles away, on foot. The officer who spoke to me was a woman named Sergeant Voss. She had close-cropped gray hair, and she knelt down to Mateo's level and spoke to him in the low, even voice of someone who had done this before. He told her, in that same quiet, careful way he talked about dinosaurs, that there was a door in the basement that Aunt Petra had told him not to touch. Sergeant Voss posted 2 officers at the basement door and called for a forensic team. I took Mateo to the living room. I got him a glass of water and a blanket from the couch. He drank the water in 3 long swallows. He hadn't had anything since the night before. We would learn that later. I sat with him, and he leaned against my arm, and after a few minutes he said, I tapped because I remembered you said if I'm ever in trouble, I should make noise. I had told him that. 2 summers ago at a family barbecue, one of those throwaway pieces of safety advice you give kids without knowing if it lands. Make noise if you're ever scared. Help is louder than silence. He remembered. I held it together until Savannah walked in the door. Then I didn't. What the forensic team found in the basement took 3 days to fully document. I was not in the house when they found it. I did not want to be. What I know from what Sergeant Voss told me in the weeks that followed, in careful, measured language. There was a crawl space behind a false panel in the utility room. The panel had been there, disguised as shelving, for at least several years. Inside the crawl space, forensics recovered the remains of 4 individuals. The oldest remains had been there for an estimated 18 to 20 years, the youngest for approximately 2. We had moved into this house 11 years ago. Lorinda had handled the purchase. Lorinda had managed the home inspection, the closing, all of it. The house had been purchased from Petra. I did not know that. I had not known Petra owned the house before we did. I did not know many things, it turned out. Things that had happened in rooms I walked through every day. In a life I thought I understood. The investigation took 14 months. The forensic work, the financial records, the testimony from neighbors who had seen things and not quite known what they were seeing. A woman 3 streets over remembered a girl, maybe 15 or 16, who had been staying with Petra years ago and then wasn't. She'd assumed the girl had moved on. She hadn't moved on. Lorinda's involvement was a matter of significant legal debate. Her attorneys argued she had no knowledge of the crawl space. The evidence suggested otherwise. Text messages recovered from her phone showed conversations with Petra going back years. Conversations that, read plainly, made clear she knew. Not everything, but enough. She pled guilty to charges of conspiracy and accessory after the fact. The plea deal was struck, I was told, in part because of her cooperation in providing information about Petra. Petra was convicted on 4 counts of murder in the 2nd degree and 1 count of kidnapping. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Lorinda received 12 years. She will be eligible for parole in 8. I have not spoken to her since the morning the police arrived. I received a letter from her, forwarded through her attorney, about 4 months after sentencing. I read the first 2 sentences. Then I folded it back up, put it in an envelope, and burned it in the backyard fire pit on a Sunday afternoon while the neighbor's dog barked at something through the fence. Some things don't deserve a response. Some doors, once you see what's on the other side, you don't go back through. Mateo was doing well. I want to say that clearly, because I know it's what people need to hear. And more than that, it's true. He's been in therapy, a child therapist who specializes in trauma, who Savannah found through the hospital's victim services program. He's been going once a week for over a year now. He doesn't talk about what happened in great detail, not with me. He said, once, about 3 months after, that he was glad I came home sick, and I had to leave the room for a minute before I could answer him. He still has his dinosaurs. He got a new set for his birthday. Savannah found a specialty store online that sold the obscure ones, the Pachycephalosaurus and the Dinosaurus, and he spent an entire afternoon organizing them by period and then explaining the organization to me with great seriousness. I sold the house. I couldn't have stayed. I bought a smaller place on the other side of Columbus, close enough that Savannah can still drop Mateo off on weekends, which she does. Bert comes sometimes too, and we watch football in the living room and don't talk about the things we're both thinking. I see a counselor myself now on Wednesday evenings, a man named Dr. Ashby, who has a very quiet office and asks questions I usually don't expect. He has helped me understand that what happened to me, the years of not seeing, of trusting in a way that made me blind, is not stupidity. It is not weakness. It is what happens when someone who loves you decides to use that love as a tool. It took me a long time to believe that. I'm still working on it. There are things I think about that I don't have answers for. 4 people in that crawl space. 4 lives that ended in a place I ate breakfast above, slept above, lived above for 11 years without knowing. I think about the girl the neighbor remembered, the one who had been staying with Petra and then wasn't. I think about whether anyone was looking for her, whether anyone reported her missing, whether the system that was supposed to catch these things saw her at all. Mostly I think about a boy sitting in the dark between the walls, rubbing his cheek against his shoulder to work a piece of tape loose, and deciding to tap because someone once told him that noise matters. I think about the 11 minutes between when I heard the first scratch and when I put my hands through that wall. I think about what would have happened if I had taken the Advil and gone to bed. If the fever had hit me harder. If my manager had let me push through the day. I don't let myself stay in those thoughts too long. Dr. Ashby calls it the what-if spiral, and he's right that it doesn't lead anywhere. But I can't help visiting it sometimes. What I try to hold on to is this. I heard it. Something made me stop in that hallway. Something told me that silence is not always empty, that the spaces we don't look into are not automatically safe. I think about the people in my life, the ones I see at church, the ones in my neighborhood, the ones at work, and I think about how easy it is to assume that a quiet house is a peaceful house, how easy it is to look at someone and see what they're showing you and call it knowing them. Children know things. Children feel things. When a child tells you something is wrong, or when a child goes quiet in a way that doesn't fit them, or when a child disappears from the routines you thought you understood, pay attention. Don't explain it away. Don't assume someone else has checked. Check yourself. Mateo told me once, about a month after everything, that he had tried to tell his mother something was wrong. Not about the wall. He didn't know about the wall then. Didn't know that was where they were going to put him. But he'd told Savannah he didn't want to go to Grandma's anymore on Tuesdays. He hadn't been able to explain why. He just knew something felt wrong and he said so. Savannah had thought he was going through a phase. She'd gently encouraged him. Told him Grandma loved him and it would be fun. She carries that with her. She will probably always carry it. I've told her, more than once, that she couldn't have known. That she was working with the information she had. That the people who should have been trustworthy were trustworthy in every way that mattered, until the one way that didn't. I don't know if it helps. I know she's listening when I say it. What I believe now, not something I was taught, something I learned from a Tuesday in October when I came home early and stood in a hallway and heard a sound that changed everything, is that the people we love can be hiding things we would never imagine, in spaces we would never think to look. And sometimes the only thing standing between a child and what's in those spaces is someone who slows down long enough to listen. I got lucky. In the worst possible way, I got lucky. Don't wait to be lucky. Listen now, while the walls are still quiet. I keep coming back to one small thing. Not the wall, not the crawl space, not the syringe in Petra's hand. I keep coming back to Matteo telling me he'd tried to say something. That he told his mother he didn't want to go to Grandma's anymore on Tuesdays. He couldn't explain why. He just knew, and we, the adults who loved him, who would have done anything for him, talked him out of it. That's the part that keeps me up, not the evil. Evil, when you finally see it, is almost simple. What's harder to sit with is how long ordinary life held it in place. How our routines, our trust, our reasonable assumptions, all of it became the walls that kept Matteo in the dark. I've thought a lot about what made the difference that Tuesday. I was sick. I was slow. I stopped in a hallway because my body couldn't move fast enough to walk past what my gut was already telling me. And I listened. For once, I actually stopped and listened. Not to the explanation I was about to be given, not to the reasonable thing my wife was about to say, but to the sound itself. What it actually was. That's not instinct. That's a choice. A small, quiet choice that most of us talk ourselves out of 100 times a day because we don't want to be wrong, don't want to be difficult, don't want to be the person who makes a scene over nothing. Matteo made that choice too, in his own way. Sitting in the dark between those studs, with his wrists zip-tied and the tape half off his face, he did the hardest thing a frightened child can do. He didn't go silent. He thought. He remembered something I told him 2 summers ago at a barbecue. Make noise, help is louder than silence. And he used it. He tapped. Methodically, deliberately, with whatever strength he had left. That kind of presence of mind in a 6-year-old, in that situation, is not luck. That is something he built. Something that was built in him by people who told him his voice mattered. I'm not wise enough to have a clean explanation for why things happened the way they did. I don't think the universe was arranging itself to save my grandson. I think a lot of terrible things happen every day to children who tap just as hard and nobody hears them. What I know is that the difference in my story, in this particular Tuesday, came down to whether the people involved had the decency to act on what they knew, the clarity to see past what they were being told, and the will to do the hard thing when it would have been much easier to take an Advil and go to bed. Lorinda had information and chose silence. Petra had a plan and chose cruelty. I had a saw and a sick feeling in my chest, and I chose to cut through the wall. The choices we make when it costs us something. That's the only honest measure of who we are. Not the values we say we hold, not the people we tell ourselves we'd be in a crisis, what we actually do in that hallway, with our hand pressed against the drywall, when every reasonable voice is telling us we're overreacting. Pay attention to the children in your life. Believe them when they say something is wrong, even when they can't tell you why. And when something doesn't add up, when the paint is a little too fresh, when the explanation comes a little too smooth, don't walk past it. Stop, listen, cut through the wall.